And good morning, everybody. This is a screencast that will help you go over the assignments for the first week and what you need to do. Some of these things we will be doing in class, so this will help you if you are not able to get into class today. If you look at your textbook, you see that I have quite a bit of information. This is for the rest of the week. And what you will be doing is you will be looking at some videos this week. We'll be showing them in class. So one of the things that we will show today is we will be looking at, so what we will be doing today in class, we will be going over this video, a failed piece, so you need to load that. We will be looking at some of the sections of the textbook and giving explanation to a political cartoon. The cartoon is right here, the Hitler's March to European Democracy, and I'll be going over that shortly. And we have a gallery that we'll be looking at. So we'll be looking at these four areas today. If you're not in class, I also posted another video. It goes into a lot more detail with accompanying notes, and if you would like, you can look at that. If you can't access the textbook, I would look at that. So let's go ahead and look at the text, how to open it up. And this one's a little different in that it has a video at the bottom of it, so I'm going to show you in a second as soon as it loads up. It's taking its time. Okay, he starts with an opening screen. This kind of shows what was going on in Germany as prior to World War I, and I would just call this whole section a prelude to war. I'm just going to move this over here. This was a rally showing the buildup of the German military. Your vocabulary terms are right here, and there is a video that you can watch, that you should watch today, and we'll be going over in class today. So we start looking at Japan and how they became very aggressive. They started earlier. We went over this last week with our League of Nations cartoon, and they had invaded Manchuria as early as 1931. They were very successful, and this really encouraged the militaristic aspect in Japan. Japan was not as much fascist as they were militaristic. The military had taken over, though, control of the country, and it was combined with a hyper-nationalism. But it was not necessarily a fascist government per se. It had elements of fascism, but was not to the extent of Italy, Germany, and Spain. Italy also got into this, and they started, we mentioned this last week, they invaded Ethiopia, and the Ethiopians resisted, but they really were not able to match the tanks, the machine guns, the poison gas, and airplanes that the Italians brought. The king appealed to the League of Nations, and the League did sanction Italy for violating the law, but they agreed to stop selling weapons and other things. But the sanctions didn't extend to petroleum, so Italy was able to keep their armies and their tanks moving, and by 1936, Italy conquers Ethiopia. Here's a series of events showing the appeasement. This is a political cartoon. It's an American cartoon. And it shows basically the goal is to be the boss of the universe. And it shows the different steps that Hitler takes before World War I that basically increases his power and what the reaction of the Allies was. So you see in the beginning, Hitler is here. And he symbolizes the growing militarism and fascism, and he's thumbing his nose at the Treaty of Versailles. He's just, basically the goal is to become the last step all the way to the boss of the universe. And he's thumbing his nose at the League of Nations, which is represented by this body here. The first part of it is basically he builds up the army, and we saw that picture in the very beginning. Germany, by the treaty, had to have a very small army. They could not build an air force, submarines, or modern weapons. Well, when Hitler takes power in 1933, he starts rebuilding the military, at first secretly, and then just publicly. In 1935, he just says, I'm going to do it. Stop me with the League of Nations, with your army. Oh, you don't have an army. You need to shut up. That same song and dance. And England and France are not willing to to do anything on their own without the League. They are still stinging from World War One. He then goes ahead and he takes over the Rhineland, which Germany was forbidden to have military forces in there. Well, he brings in the military there and arms it. So he's arming the borders. The plan was if France did anything, Germany would have backed out. They didn't want a war. They didn't think they were ready for war. And they didn't want a war at this time. Not that, their goal was power, but they weren't ready for a war. Well, France does nothing. And that sends a big message to Hitler that he's going to keep on going. Later on, he goes ahead. I missed this up. We talked about rearmament. And then later on, he wants to go to Danzig, which is a port city. And Poland, it was a German city, but Poland was given rights of it so they could have a naval base and also have access to the Baltic Sea. Danzig was a region with many Germans, and it was basically, you had a part of Germany here and a part of Germany here, and you had the Danzig corridor here, which was Polish territory. So he'll be going after Danzig, and Lowe's prediction was inaccurate. Hitler's next move was to go to Austria through an Anschluss, and this happened when Hitler, when the Austrian president refused to name a German person to a high post, and Hitler basically, working with the Austrian Nazi party, was able to secure an Anschluss, a joining together of Austria and Germany. And later on, this keeps going on with more appeasement, and it goes on into start World War II, with the invasion of Poland in 1939. All of these were called appeasement. Appeasement basically is when you give in to the demands of an aggressor in order to keep peace. This was the policy that England and France were doing, and they were the main powers in Europe. Basically, the British had no desire to go to war again, and France was demoralized from all these political divisions at home, and internally they were a mess. And this is why, and Hitler realized this. He realized that France was in no position; they just were too divided to have a cohesive action, and Britain would not act on their own. And so this is what he kind of understood that, and he kept on moving toward these aggressive moves that were political moves, but also were backed by the threat of military aggression. The United States stays neutral, and they actually passed laws called Neutrality Acts, which has the idea they can't sell arms to any nation at war. You can't give money to warring nations, and you couldn't travel on ships to parts that are at war. These are very restrictive wars, and the goal is stay out of involvement in a European war, not to prevent the conflict, but to stay out of it. Let them fight if they want. So we have some timelines here. This is kind of important information. Mussolini becomes powerful in 1922. He becomes the prime minister. He's a fascist. Then in 1931, Japan invades Manchuria. In 1933, Hitler becomes the prime minister of Germany, and by 1934, he's basically the dictator of Germany, and the Nazi party, although not a majority, is in control of pretty much every aspect of life. Italy invades Ethiopia in 1935. Germany annexes Austria and Czechoslovakia in political maneuvers that Great Britain and France did not stop. There was no way that this could go on, and England and France had strong treaties with Poland to protect their security. And when Hitler invades Poland, World War II begins when France and England declare war on Germany. In 1941, Tojo becomes the leader of the Japanese militarists in the 1930s, and by 1941, he is also now the prime minister. He serves under the emperor, but the emperor is just basically a token leader, and he's the one that really pushes for the Japanese expansion using military force. So you have basically the formation of the Axis powers. At first it's Germany and Italy, and then Japan joins them, and they became known as the Axis, the Rome, Berlin, Tokyo Axis. And they agreed that they were going to fight against communism. They also agreed they would not interfere with others' plans for expansion. And this agreement, this alliance or this axis, gave them strength to go ahead and move forward into war. Now, the Spanish Civil War is mentioned in the other podcast, and this is basically a prelude or proxy war to World War II. Spain is a republic in the early 1930s. The monarchy is kind of cast aside. The Republican government is very controversial. It's very aggressive. One thing is they take on the church. They really go after the church, and Spain is an exceptionally religious Catholic country. It also took large amounts of land from landowners and gave it away to peasants. And it ended a lot of privileges that the certain elements of society, mostly the upper class and the military, had enjoyed for hundreds of years in Spain. This really splits the country, though. It wasn't just the wealthy and the military and the religious people, although most of Spain was very religious. So when they saw this is something that the French had found out, and it took Napoleon to say, let's leave the church alone or else our revolution is going to be in trouble. The Spanish government is going after the church. There's a large number of communists in the government who are on the far side of the government, the far left, and they're also pushing for a lot of actions against the church and the people who own property. The military has had enough of the conflict, and they don't ideologically agree. The upper middle class of the high-ranking officers in the military do not agree with the revolution, and they rebel. They go to war with their own government. This is a brutal civil war. Atrocities happening on both sides. Other countries are checking out their military. Hitler and Mussolini send weapons, and also the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, is involved. The Soviet Union sent soldiers to fight on side of the loyalists. And we mentioned in the other video, governments of Britain, France, and the United States, they stay neutral, but volunteers from all these countries, including quite a few from the United States, which formed the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, fight in this war. Horrible atrocities exist in both sides. This is an ideological fight to the death, and air raids happen. One is launched by the German Luftwaffe on a market town, and they planned it to have the most devastating effects to civilian population as well as military population. In the end, and this was done to see what their planes could do. It was just running a test raid. This is called a dress rehearsal to World War II because it shows the tactics and the weapons that can be used. This is a famous photo by Robert Capa, who will have many such photos in World War II, of a loyalist soldier being shot and killed. In the end, by 1939, late 1938, 1939, prior to World War I starting, Franco and the generals are successful, and they establish a fascist government similar to that of Hitler and Mussolini. One thing they don't get involved in, they stay out of World War II. They are trying to recover. A large amount of Spanish volunteers do fight in the German army. The other thing is that they don't get involved in the more extreme atrocities of World War II, such as the Holocaust. They are not involved. They just want to have their type of government, which is basically has strong elements of socialism, strong control by the military, and is restrictive. It's a fascist government and stays in power for a number of years. But they do not get involved in World War II or the worst parts of the genocide of the Nazis. The Germans they're still moving very aggressively. There's a speech announcing the annexation of Austria. And basically, when Austria was given some demands by the Germans, by Germany, and basically Hitler sent in the German army, as pictured here. And he was saying it's because Austrian people wanted. Now, some did. A sizable majority of them did want the Anschluss, but it violates Versailles. It's an invasion. It creates a war scare. But the Western democracies didn't take any action. So this is another picture of another excursion. It's the occupying of the Sudetenland and then all of Czechoslovakia, in which Britain basically gives in. And this is Neville Chamberlain saying, I've reached peace with Mr. Hitler, but he gave away all of Czechoslovakia to get that peace. The big thing here is that the French and British are laying down to Hitler. And Hitler, one person understands it. This is Churchill. He says, if we do not suppose that this is the end, this is only the beginning of the reckoning This is the first sip, and this is by Winston